China has more numbers when it comes to things like missiles, long-range drones, and they have them in theater. One of the big issues with the United States is that we suffer from what we call the tyranny of distance. We have to get troops and supplies around 6,100 miles from about 10,000 kilometers across the sea, whereas China has most of their stuff close by. So they're at an advantage right there.
This is The Global Gambit. Military matters, geopolitical matters. Before coming on, my guest and I were discussing what we should talk about, and one of the things we thought we should talk about is China, really. And China seems to be very much in the eyes of Trump from an economic standpoint, but there is a lot of military assessments and shifts happening as well. We've seen the PLA conducting exercises around Taiwan. There's been intelligence shifts. But because I think of the news cycle and how much Trump is just doing so many things against so many different groups, or saying things about so many different entities, you never really know where to look. And someone who seems to do a very good job of managing all of that and providing his own very unique takes is Ryan McBeth, who we had on back in December, and it was a very nice end to the year. I think, Ryan, we capped it off nicely, and I don't know, maybe I was cautiously or sort of naively optimistic about Trump wanting to actually maybe support Ukraine, and he's come through and made it pretty clear he wasn't like that. But, we've touched along about Ukraine a lot and China, and you made a really interesting video just a couple of weeks ago about the PLA's shifts at the moment. So I was kind of wondering if you can take us through a little bit what you've been seeing there and why you felt that deserved a bit of attention.
Absolutely. Well, I can tell you that it seems like the U.S. has finally decided to shift our priorities over to China. And actually, this kind of touches on Ukraine in some ways, because one of the there's essentially two major fears. The first is that China has told its military to be ready to invade Taiwan by 2027. That doesn't mean they're going to invade Taiwan by 2027, but it is likely that they will be prepared to invade by 2027. I kind of believe that it's most likely China will invade Taiwan by 2028, because that's an election year. And so there's just a lot more disadvantage for the United States when dealing with China during an election year. Now, actually, one of the reasons that I believe we started to abandon support for Ukraine, and this kind of comes from some people in the administration, is that I've said it's almost like the idea is that if Ukraine wins, that's fine. If Russia wins, that's fine. If neither side win, that's fine as well. The war needs to stop, so that way the United States can pull forces out of Europe, and the United States can move some of those forces to the Pacific. I would not be surprised if the 173rd Airborne, which is a separate brigade in Italy, I would not be surprised if that unit ends up in a place like the Philippines, permanently based in a place like the Philippines. So that's probably one of the reasons why we've been pushing for Europe to kind of get its defense act together, because if we can pull everybody out except maybe one brigade of armor, which wouldn't be of much use in the Pacific theater anyway, we can pull everybody out but one brigade of armor. Right now we have, I think it's 84,000 troops in Europe. And that's a lot more troops that we can use in the Pacific theater. So that might be kind of the president's strategy here, where at this point he doesn't really care if Russia wins or Russia takes land. He doesn't care if Russia is defeated. He just wants the war to be done. That way we can concentrate on Asia. Now,
yeah, that's been my sentiment since Trump really began making his foreign policy ideas more public. I think everything revolves around combating China in whatever realm you want to say, but it is around largely China. And we've seen those military drills. I alluded to them in my very ad hoc introduction, but essentially, they've been doing live fire drills around Taiwanese Strait, and there was an interesting piece actually in Newsweek today about how China's military is quietly gaining control of the Pacific. Do you agree with that? Because I don't think they have control of it. They're certainly trying to flex more, but do they really control it when you've got the second island chain, first island chain there, and the US is quite effective grand strategic approach, or that is changing because of Trump so quickly?
So control is kind of a weird word, right? Do you? So China is at an advantage in the sense that they have gone out to these small island chains and they started dumping concrete on it and kind of building them up into actual honest to God bases, where they could launch aircraft, where they could act as refueling depots, where they could launch missiles from, right? Now, these bases are very precarious, but when you think about it, the United States has done something similar. We have a strategy called ACE, Agile Combat Employment. And the whole idea behind ACE is that missiles have a cost, right? China has a heck of a lot of conventional ballistic missiles that can be launched toward air bases. And when China launches these missiles, you better not be on the ground, or your planes, your aircraft, your crew are going to be killed. So the whole idea is to constantly shift what base your planes are at during these operations. So that way, China never knows what base you're on. And this is why we have multi-capable airmen now, guys who can arm a plane and also maybe refuel the plane, when that used to be two separate jobs, right? And the whole idea is that you should be able to step over the body of your dying buddy in order to turn that jet and get that jet back in the air. And so the United States has started to clear off a lot of these bases in the Pacific that we used during World War II. We've removed the brush, we've extended the runways, we've refurbished the runways, and now we can use these things as jump-off points to refuel fighters and rearm fighters. So we're doing kind of a similar thing. And when you think about it, any base out in the middle of the ocean is vulnerable. But China does own those bases, or at least they claim to own them. And they can project power from that either by using missiles or by using them as refueling stops for their planes. I actually am not sure how many tankers China has. So that would be People's Liberation Army Air Force refueling tankers.
Right.
That's, boy, I shouldn't have brought that up because I don't know the answer to that. But
well, isn't it though that China generally has more numbers of assets, right, units, but they still don't spend as much, and the equipment levels. I was reading one piece in preparation for our chat, and it was saying that China's equipment levels are only 42% of US levels. That was analysis done by Rand and a couple of other academic sort of back sources. Like, so would you say that that's accurate? Like, China has more units, but the sort of aggregate numbers are different, if that makes sense, across different asset classes or something?
So that's a tough question. China has more numbers when it comes to things like missiles, long-range drones, and they have them in theater. One of the big issues with the United States is that we suffer from what we call the tyranny of distance. We have to get troops and supplies around 6,100 miles from about 10,000 kilometers across the sea, whereas China has most of their stuff close by. So they're at an advantage right there. When it comes to brigades, like army brigades, I believe China has 72 brigades, and the U.S., including the National Guard, has about 52, something like that, roughly. So, and their brigades are bigger. So their brigades have about, U.S. brigade, I don't know, it really depends. It could have between 2,500 to 3,600 troops. It all kind of depends on the kind of brigade you have, whether it's a heavy brigade combat team, medium brigade combat team, infantry brigade combat team, or you have Chinese units that I think their brigades are about 4,700 troops, roughly. Again, it depends on what kind of brigade they have. So they have about 300 extra people per brigade. Yeah.
No, I always feel kind of satisfied when you say that's a tough question, because it means I'm pushing the boundaries of your very exhaustive knowledge there, Rob. But
some of it's also like I don't have the figures on hand. Like I just did the video and I'm like, oh crap, does China have 72 or 74 brigades? I can't remember, but it's in the 70s, and the U.S., and that includes the National Guard. And while the National Guard is a critical component of American defense, it still takes a couple of weeks to get the National Guard activated and retrained, trained up to standard, and then sent someplace. And when you deal with something like a National Guard Heavy Brigade combat team, which probably wouldn't be used in the Pacific, Heavy Brigade combat team, all right, you have to go through your tank tables, right, where you go through as an individual and you qualify on your tank to certify that you can do gunnery, and then you qualify as a platoon, right? And that takes time to physically do those tables, and there's only a certain number of bases that have the facilities to allow you to do tank qualification. So, something like a Heavy Brigade combat team, it could take weeks, months, really, to get them fully trained up. And then once they're fully trained up, now you have to get all their equipment on a railhead, put it on a ship, and move it someplace, right? It's a little bit different for things like Stryker brigades, which are the wheeled vehicles that the U.S. has. The 28th National Guard, 28th Division, has one brigade of Strykers, and they're in Pennsylvania. They could probably get moved out fairly fast, because one neat thing about Strykers is that they could self-deploy because they're wheeled. They can just drive on the roads someplace, right? And you see Strykers in Pennsylvania driving all the time to New Jersey, to Fort Dix, New Jersey, just driving right on the roads. That's a pretty big advantage of the Stryker platform, but it would still take weeks. So I believe in the active duty Army, I want to say we have 25 or so brigades, and then the National Guard supplies like 30 more brigades as well. Again, that math might be a little off, but it would take about 2 to 6, about 6 to 8 weeks to get like a light infantry brigade ready to go someplace. So,
I was kind of curious actually, because one of the things, coming at war matters, but from geopolitical, right, or top down, if you like, is that there's a lot of opaqueness about China's general capabilities. And obviously there's been some arguments that their economy is a lot smaller than they claim. And so one wonders about their real military competency, right? They haven't really been in an active war since the 1960s, 70s with the Indians and the border clashes with the Soviets, wasn't it?
1979, they fought a war with Vietnam.
Was that really significant test of their military prowess, though?
I mean, it kind of depends, right? Like they essentially invaded Vietnam while Vietnam was in Cambodia.
Mm-hmm.
And essentially, China got their butts kicked by a bunch of border guards. And
that's because I'm thinking of actual proper, military clash.
Yeah, and when you think about it, we haven't either. The U.S. really hasn't either.
No, that's fair. I appreciate people in the comments might well say that, well, hang on, we haven't had a symmetrical quote unquote war for a long time, although I really hate that kind of phrasing. I think asymmetrical is overused these days. But more the point I'm kind of curious is just like, if you boil down to sort of, aside from specific unions or battalions or whatever, like how much is China really capable? For example, their maritime capabilities. They have these fishing boats and all that sort of stuff that have been up and around the western side of South America, for example. We've seen satellite imagery and reports of that in the past few years. Like, if they were to go toe to toe with the Americans, granted the Americans are, the US hasn't had its fair share of real tries either. But like, what's your assessment there? Because so much came out of Russia's events with Ukraine, and well, that's thrown so many of our principles out of the water. No, don't know if what I'm saying makes sense, but I'm just sort of curious what you think about real China. How much is China overhyping, inflating its real capabilities?
I don't believe they're necessarily inflating their capabilities at all. It seems like they have a modern military with modern training. They just recently they give benefits to reservists. So if you're a Chinese reservist, you actually get protection from getting fired from your job when you have to go to reserve duty. They're trying to build up their class of NCOs, non-commissioned officers, which is essential in any kind of modern army where you're allowing people to make decisions down at the lower level. So they kind of avoided that top-down command structure that Russia has engaged in. Although even Russia is slowly starting to kind of get away from that. Russia is learning, from their experience in Ukraine. It's the real question mark here is logistics,
right?
Because I've said that the U.S. really hasn't fought a major LISCO conflict since technically the initial invasion of Iraq in 2023, but and for 20 years the United States was performing what we call COIN, or counterinsurgency. Yeah. So we were essentially fighting the wrong war for about 20 years. However, there is some crossover. I mean, even though we've been fighting the wrong war, one of the things that you still get out of that is the ability to make decisions under pressure, real world decisions under pressure. And the other thing is logistics. And one story that I love to tell is how I was in Egypt. And we were taking over this combat outpost from a unit that was rotating out. And at this combat outpost, it was about 300 meters in a 300-meter circle. And we had trailers there, which we lived in. Some of those trailers were air conditioned. Our tactical operations center was air conditioned. We had a bathroom with a shower that was powered by solar. Like the solar would heat up the water tank, so you could take a lukewarm shower, if you were one of the three people to, first in line, right? We had satellite TV in a day room, where we could relax and watch TV. Across the street from us, there was this Egyptian border guard post, and this Egyptian border guard post had two dudes with one uniform each. They had a 55-gallon drum that would be filled up every day or every week with a water tanker. And that was what they cooked out of, bathed out of, did their ablutions out of, and drank out of. And every day their first sergeant would come by with a bag of rice and vegetables and drop it off, and that was their food for the day. So we took over this site, and one of the things you do when you take over a site is you go over the checklist. Like, all right, do they have all their ammunition? Yes, you sign for the ammunition. Do they have all their equipment? Yes, you sign over the transfer of equipment. Another thing you did was you checked the freezer, because we had a kitchen on site and we had a cook. And the cook would make us breakfast and dinner. And I looked in the freezer to make sure nothing was expired, like there was no expired food. And there were these 3 bags of chicken patties, these frozen chicken patties, frozen breaded chicken patties that were about to expire. And I was like, well, let's just cook it all. So for about 3 days, we ate chicken patties for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, to the point where the men were getting sick of eating chicken patties. So I had the cook it all, and I brought it over to the Egyptians. And they were so happy because through their Arabic, or their English and my Arabic, I was able to kind of get out of them that they only got meat when they rotated back to their main base. And even then it was what they called army meat, which I might be mistranslating, but it sounded like meat that was rejected by their equivalent of health inspectors. So you couldn't sell army meat to the general public, but you were allowed to sell it to the army. And that's when it struck me that the U.S. isn't powerful because of our Patriot missiles and our M1 tanks. It's powerful because we can get more breaded chicken patties halfway around the world than we can possibly eat. And the Egyptians could even feed their own people in their own country. So I've often said the U.S. Army is really a logistics organization that dabbles in warfare. Right? We can just get more stuff across the ocean than anyone possibly can. And kind of the big question mark is, what is Chinese logistics like? Because we have had years to perfect. Almost, Cold War, 1950-ish, right? Cold War started in 1950. So we've had 70 some years.
Well, I've got two questions on this because I think it's one of the more interesting aspects. One's about China's logistical potential, and the other one's about Trump's effect on US logistical provision, if that makes to the Europeans specifically, I'm thinking of. But that first question about China, America has 800 plus bases around the world in different formats. Yeah. China has 1, 2, Djibouti, and I think there's another one now. But I know it's not just about bases, but realistically, what does China really have to do to have that logistical supply chain network? It needs an alliance basis the same way that the US does, right? China doesn't have the presence in South Asia like America does with Guam, with Japan, with South Korea, and etc. So I don't know, am I seeing that the right way, or am I missing something in that?
Well, when you think about it, theoretically, every Chinese port is a Chinese base.
Right. But is it though? Because it's not kitted out for the right, is it?
I mean, look, if you bring in a shipping container full of drones, is anyone really going to check that thing? Right? I'm serious. The way
I understand it. I'm thinking more from hardware.
When President Trump, for right or wrong, said that Panama had made a deal with China and we can't let this deal go through. We can't let China control the Panama Canal. He wasn't wrong, because there's 2 ports on either side of the Panama Canal, which is owned by a Hong Kong company. Mm-hmm. And if I were the Chinese Communist Party, I would certainly have agents working there. And it wouldn't be so hard to take a container ship and scuttle it right at the mouth of the Panama Canal. And now it takes weeks or however long it takes to raise a ship from the bottom, right? Repair it, raise that ship from the bottom, and move it out of the way. And that eliminates the ability for U.S. forces to go through the Panama Canal in order to get to the Pacific. They'd have to go all the way around Strait of Magellan, right? So the president wasn't wrong about that, right? He just has trouble articulating sometimes, exactly the exact issue, because he might only have surface level knowledge, or his advisors might only have surface level knowledge, and he's kind of going off what they say. But when you think about it, any port that's owned by China is theoretically a vector for asymmetric warfare, where they could have container ships loaded with drones, and these container ships could actually be fighting platforms. So you could have a ship floating over to the United States from China, and they might have regular containers with goods from China loaded in there, but the top containers have missiles in them. So these Chinese ships approach the port of Los Angeles, and they can fire cruise missiles. I can practically guarantee you that if or when, most likely when, this war kicks off with China, the United States is going to be struck by drones and missiles.
You made an interesting video about how drones, are they really replacing helicopters? I mean, from a maybe assault perspective, but logistical perspective, are drones able to really replace helicopters? Because helicopters can transport people.
So
right?
one advantage of manned helicopters is that you can't really jam them, right? The only way for a drone to actually replace a manned helicopter, in the sense of these helicopters are carrying troops, is if you give that drone some sort of autonomous capability. And we are really weird about that. Ukraine has actually given one of their drones. It's a copy of the Shahed. It's a little bit smaller. It's called the Seth, and that has autonomous targeting.
Right.
So when you're operating the Seth, you can say, hey, I want you to look for a tank. If you can't find a tank, I want you to look for an armored personnel carrier. So fly to this point, look for an armored personnel carrier or a tank, and then dive down on that and destroy it. So they have that capability now. The U.S. is really weird about that for understandable reasons, because that gets into Terminators, right? That gets into killer robots. And kind of the question here is, are we mentally ready to have killer robots on the battlefield actually doing our killing without a human in the loop? Right? And that would be called HODL, human out of the loop. Are we ready for HODL drones? And that's a pretty good question that I can't necessarily answer.
Well, I want to ask you a bit more about that in part 2, which is obviously a little teaser for everyone knowing that this will be 2 parts, because he doesn't love 2 parts with Ryan, right? But my second question I had about that sort of element of logistics is that Trump really is making it clear that he has an antipathy towards, well, as you made it clear, Ukraine's continued resistance. But Europe is obviously the opposite of that. And so we're seeing the point where threats of withdrawing troops from Eastern Europe, and generally sort of defunding or just severely undermining NATO's capabilities. But, let's do a scenario whereby Europe can somehow get its act together and replace, to a certain extent, American defense in parts of Europe. I think the biggest area, from my understanding, that Europe has a Achilles heel is logistics. Is there what do you think about that? Is that something that's true? Is the US overstretched in logistics sometimes?
No, I don't think so.
Could there be a scenario whereby Europe, I don't know, pays America for logistical support, but they provide the actual offensive and defensive capabilities for Ukraine? For example?
They do that right now. I mean, for the most part,
needed though?
Yeah, for the most part, Europe only has 2 militaries that can become expeditionary forces. This is actually one of the reasons why I roll my eyes when people say that Russia started the war in Ukraine because of NATO expansion. NATO only has 3 militaries that can actually perform expeditionary operations. It's the U.S., Great Britain, and France. Those are the only 3 nations within NATO that can actually project power outside of their own countries. Every other nation in NATO is, for the most part, a defensive army. So, like the idea of Estonia or Poland invading Russia, they could invade Kaliningrad, but the idea of Estonia or Latvia, Lithuania, Poland invading Russia is laughable, not because of their bravery or the ability of their troops, but because they just don't have the logistical ability without the United States helping, right? So that's kind of one thing that I say when people talk about, look at NATO, they antagonized Russia by moving so close to their border. I mean, NATO is never going to invade Russia. That's not in the cards, right? Now, for the most part, when NATO nations have had to do expeditionary operations, they have leaned heavily on the U.S. for logistics. There are some exceptions, like the Netherlands might send a ship to a disaster zone in the southern hemisphere, right? Like after an earthquake. They have that capability. They have some expeditionary capability, but not the ability for expeditionary operations at scale, right? So yeah, they do have to rely on the United States a lot for logistics. I could see something like that where NATO agrees to kind of take over Europe as long as the United States pursues the logistics part of it. So yeah, I think that was your question, right? Largely
speaking, I think that I can't see how the the British or the French can really replace every single facet. For example, Germany's obviously released its brakes on the debt ceiling or whatever it is. I forget the name exactly. But yeah, I feel like the logistics capacity is just not there yet, and never will be, because they just don't have. They have to be, I think, specialist or selective in what they focus on. And I think there are certain comparative advantages that the French and the British do have, respective to other European nations, not the Americans. But yeah, that was largely the question, because I'm curious, if Trump is withdrawing, disengaging globally, what does that mean for US logistical sustainment globally versus China and Russia and others who are trying to increase their logistical capabilities, right?
Well, it'd be a lot harder. It would be a lot harder for Europe to project any kind of power. It was the U.S. that heck, Ukraine was in Afghanistan, right? Ukraine had units in Afghanistan, and those units were refueled, rearmed, fed by American-supported convoys, right? That delivered supplies to those units. So it's very difficult for Europe to kind of project power anywhere without the U.S. And of course, the exception to that is Great Britain and France, which have their own logistical capabilities and can operate independently, not at the same scale of the U.S., but they can support their own troops.
Well, on that point, I've got a very juicy question about, troop numbers and age and willingness to draft, conscription, but people will have to tune in for part 2 for that. So we'll see you all in that. Take care, Ron. People might have to get, uncomfortable with the fact that they have to conscribe, right, or conscript. Mm-hmm. Do you think that we're heading in that direction or not really?
I think so. I mean, Germany has reintroduced, or they're considering reintroducing conscription, including women. And I think Germany ended its conscription in 2012. It might actually not be a bad idea.